Most disturbing, mobile shop horror stories. Levi tightened the lock on his mobile shop's glass door, his fingers trembling slightly. The storm outside wasn't just loud, it was oppressive. The rain battered the pavement like relentless drumming, and occasional flashes of lightning illuminated the deserted street. His breath fogged the glass for a moment before he turned away. It was late. Too late. But he had to finish repairing the phone left earlier. The device lay on his workbench, unremarkable at first glance. Just an old flip phone, scratched, worn, unloved. It didn't even seem worth fixing. Levi had almost laughed at the note that came with it. Please restore. Payment will come later. That laughter had long faded. The phone felt heavy, not in weight, but in its presence, as if it carried something unseen, something watching. He shook the thought away, adjusting his magnifying lamp and picking up his tools. Focus, Levi. It's just a phone. But was it? The storm roared outside, thunder shaking the walls. The shop lights flickered, their hum stuttering with every surge of electricity. He muttered a curse under his breath. Stupid storm. Perfect timing. For hours, Levi worked in near silence. Save for the occasional scrape of his tools, the shop felt colder now, like the storm was seeping inside. Finally, with a shaky breath, he connected the last wire. The phone powered on. Its screen glowed an eerie green, faint but unmistakable in the dim room. Levi blinked, leaning closer as a single word appeared. Hello? His heart skipped. No way. That has to be some kind of glitch, he whispered. He reached out, hesitating before brushing the buttons. The screen flickered. Can you hear me? Levi froze. His chest tightened. He glanced around the room, half expecting someone to jump out of the shadows. It's pre-programmed, he said aloud, trying to convince himself. But then, help me. The words felt personal, desperate. His stomach twisted, but he couldn't look away. The shop seemed impossibly quiet now. The storm outside muted, like someone had turned the volume down. His breath caught in his throat. This isn't funny, he muttered, louder this time. Who's messing with me? The phone buzzed violently in response, rattling against the counter. Levi flinched. He stared at it, every instinct screaming to toss it away, but his fingers betrayed him. Slowly, he typed, "Who are you?" The screen dimmed for a moment, as if considering the question. Then, "Find the key." Levi's brow furrowed. "Key? What key?" he whispered, his voice trembling. The phone buzzed again. "Look behind you!" The words hit him like a punch. His blood ran cold. He didn't want to look. Every fiber of his being screamed, "Don't turn around." But he had to. Slowly, painfully, Levi turned. At first, he saw nothing but the dimly lit room, but then a shadow shifted. In the far corner, near the storage shelves. It wasn't just the storm's flicker or his imagination. Something moved. "Who's there?" His voice cracked. No reply. The shadow stretched unnaturally, merging with the dim light. Levi grabbed a wrench from the workbench, holding it out like a lifeline. His knuckles turned white as he crept toward the corner. The faint creak of the floorboards beneath him was deafening. When he reached the corner, there was nothing. The shelves were lined with spare parts, cables, and dust. No shadow. No person. He exhaled shakily, backing away. "I'm losing it," he whispered. But when he turned back to the counter, the phone was gone. His pulse thundered in his ears. "Number no. He scanned the room frantically, his breath coming in shallow gasps. "Where?" The radio on the shelf crackled to life, its static cutting through the silence. Levi spun toward it, his wrench clattering to the floor. The static grew louder, morphing into a guttural whisper. "The key is in the box." The voice was low, fragmented, like it came from a place that shouldn't exist. Levi's eyes darted to the battered box the phone had arrived in. His hands trembled as he opened it. Inside was a folded piece of paper. Basement. Levi's breath hitched. His throat felt like sandpaper. What? Basement? Then he remembered. The trapdoor near the back room. The one he'd never opened. He'd dismissed it as a crawl space, forgotten under layers of dust and time. Now it loomed in his mind like a dark secret. His feet moved on their own, carrying him toward the back. The rug covering the trapdoor was heavier than he remembered. He pushed it aside, revealing the iron ring handle. It felt ice cold to the touch. With a strained groan, he pulled it open. The smell of damp earth wafted up, and a narrow staircase led down into the dark. Levi stood at the edge, every instinct begging him to walk away. But something, some unseen force, drew him in. Step by step he descended. Each creak of the stairs echoed like a scream. The air grew thicker, colder, wrapping around him like a shroud. At the bottom, his flashlight illuminated a small stone room. In the center was a wooden chest, ancient and worn. The phone buzzed in his pocket, making him jump. He pulled it out, and the screen read, "Open it!" His heart pounded. The room felt alive, the walls closing in. Slowly, he lifted the chest's lid. Inside was a single key. The moment he touched it, the air seemed to shift. A low hum filled the room, growing louder, heavier. The phone screen flickered. A distorted face appeared. A man's, his features warped as if submerged underwater. The voice whispered again, faint but clear, "Thank you for freeing me." The screen went dark. The hum stopped. Levi stood there, the key in his hand, the room eerily silent. He turned to leave, climbing the stairs two at a time, desperate to escape. Back in the shop, everything seemed normal. The storm raged on, the flickering lights steady now. But as Levi set the phone down, it buzzed one last time. The screen displayed a single message. "Others will come. Don't let them in." It powered off for good. Levi locked the shop that night, swearing he'd never return. But even as he walked home in the rain, he couldn't shake the feeling of unseen eyes watching, following. And in his pocket, the key burned cold. This is very creepy mobile shop horror story number 2. The rain pounded relentlessly against the windows of the small mobile repair shop. Inside, Victor sat hunched over his cluttered workbench, fiddling with the innards of a shattered smartphone. The rhythmic ticking of the wall clock echoed in the silent room, interrupted only by the occasional distant rumble of thunder. Victor sighed, leaning back in his chair, stretching his arms. It had been a slow, uneventful week, and tonight seemed no different. Just another dreary evening in his shop. The loneliness of it all weighed on him, though he'd never admit it. Then it happened. The bell above the door jingled. Victor jumped, his heart skipping a beat. The sound, so sudden and unexpected, shattered the stillness of the room. His eyes darted to the entrance, where a tall figure stood framed in the doorway, rain dripping from his black coat onto the floor. The man stepped inside, his movements deliberate, unhurried. He carried an air of unease with him, something Victor couldn't quite place but felt in his chest like a cold, creeping weight. "Evening," Victor managed, his voice hesitant. "Can I help you?" The man didn't answer right away. He placed a battered briefcase on the counter, his gloved hands moving with eerie precision. With a soft click, he unlatched it and revealed its contents. An old rotary phone, its surface cracked and faded, the kind you'd expect to see in an antique store or a museum. Victor frowned. "That's quite old. I'm not sure You fix phones, don't you? The man's voice was low, gravelly, and carried a weight that made Victor's skin prickle. Well, yes, but I specialize in mobiles. This is a rotary phone. I'm not sure I have the right tools for... The man's gaze snapped up, and Victor froze. His eyes, sharp, cold, and unyielding, bored into Victor's own. Fix it, Yawsunt. Victor swallowed hard, his protest dying in his throat. There was something about this man. Something that made it impossible to argue. He nodded stiffly. Okay, let me take a look. The man handed him a folded piece of paper. When it's done, call this number. Victor opened his mouth to ask questions, but the man had already turned and was walking out the door. The bell jingled again as the door closed, and Victor was left standing there, staring at the strange phone on his counter. The unease lingered. Victor shook his head, muttering under his breath, "It's just a phone, Victor. Nothing to freak out about." He picked it up, the cool metal feeling heavier than it should, and brought it to his workbench. The storm outside intensified, and the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead seemed louder than usual. As he unscrewed the back of the phone, a chill ran down his spine. He glanced over his shoulder, the irrational feeling that someone or something was watching him taking root in his mind. The phone's wiring was ancient, yet surprisingly intact. He worked carefully, his hands steady despite the growing knot of anxiety in his stomach. After what felt like hours, he connected the last wire and plugged the phone into a makeshift adapter. The moment he did, the lights flickered. Victor froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The shop was eerily quiet until the phone's rotary dial began spinning on its own. Click, click, click. The sound cut through the silence, deliberate and unnatural. Victor's breath caught in his throat. And then the phone rang. The sharp, jarring sound made him flinch. It shouldn't have worked. He knew that. And yet, it rang again. Victor stared at it, paralyzed by fear. The ringing grew louder, more insistent, as if demanding his attention. Against every instinct screaming at him to stop, he reached out, his hand trembling, and picked up the receiver. "Hello?" Static hissed on the other end. For a moment, he thought that was all there was, until a faint voice whispered his name. "Victor." He froze, his blood turning to ice. Who is this?" The line crackled, and the voice replied, soft and mournful. "You must listen. He's coming back." Victor's heart pounded. "Who's coming?" "What are you talking about?" The line went dead. His shaking hand lowered the receiver as his mind raced. He stared at the folded paper the man had left, his unease growing. He unfolded it carefully, revealing a single phone number scrawled in neat handwriting. 5550133. Beneath it, the words, "Do not ignore the call." Before he could process the message, the bell above the door jingled again. Victor's head snapped up, his breath hitching. The man was back, his presence as unsettling as before. "Did you call the number?" the man asked, his tone unreadable. Victor's voice faltered. "Number but." The phone rang. Someone called me." The man's eyes narrowed. "What did they say?" Victor hesitated. "They said, 'Someone's coming.'" "Who? What does this mean?" The man's expression darkened. "You shouldn't have answered." Before Victor could respond, the rotary phone began to ring again. The man stiffened, his body tense. "Don't answer it," he warned, his voice sharp. Victor's gaze darted between the man and the phone, the ringing growing louder and louder. The air in the room seemed to thicken, pressing down on him like an invisible weight. And then, the shadows in the corners of the room began to move. Victor's breath quickened as he watched the darkness coalesce, forming a towering, indistinct figure. Its presence was overwhelming, suffocating, and its voice was a guttural growl that echoed in Victor's mind. The man pulled a strange etched symbol from his coat and held it toward the phone. "Stay back," he commanded, though Victor couldn't tell if he was speaking to the figure or to him. The phone glowed faintly, and the room trembled. The figure roared, its voice a cacophony of rage and despair. Victor stumbled back, his legs weak beneath him. The man muttered something in a language Victor didn't recognize, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. The glow from the phone intensified, and with a final deafening roar, the figure dissolved into nothingness. The room fell silent. Victor sat on the floor, trembling, his chest heaving with every shaky breath. The man calmly placed the rotary phone back into his briefcase, his movements deliberate, almost serene. What was that?" Victor whispered, his voice barely audible. The man looked at him, his expression unreadable. Some things should remain broken. With that, he turned and walked out into the storm, leaving Victor alone with his fear and the lingering echoes of the supernatural. The rain hammered against the windows as Victor sat in stunned silence. He didn't know how long he stayed there, staring at the spot where the man had stood. And then the shop's cordless phone began to ring. This is very terrifying. Mobile Shop Horror Story number 3. The October night felt unusually thick, as though the very air weighed heavily upon everything. The streets outside Julian's mobile repair shop were almost entirely deserted, the occasional gust of wind rustling fallen leaves. Inside, the only sounds were the rhythmic ticking of the clock and the faint hum of fluorescent lights overhead, buzzing in that maddening way they always did. Julian, hunched over his cluttered workbench, was focused on the task at hand. He'd been there for hours, losing track of time, and now it was nearly midnight. His fingers stiff from the long hours, he worked on an old, battered phone. As he adjusted the tiny screws, the glow of his work lamp highlighted his tired eyes. The low murmur of the rain outside began to grow louder, like the storm was getting closer. Suddenly, the silence was shattered by the unmistakable sound of the front door's bell, its faint jingle cutting through the air. Julian froze, his heart skipping a beat. He hadn't heard the door open, hadn't seen anyone enter. His mind immediately told him to ignore it, just another glitch of his tired imagination. But no. The bell had sounded. He slowly turned toward the doorway, his breath caught in his throat. Standing in the doorway was a man. He was tall, his figure almost shrouded by the dark overcoat he wore. The darkness of the night seemed to cling to him, as though the shadows themselves had found a companion. Julian could only make out the faintest outline of his face, eyes that didn't reflect the light. Just deep, empty voids. Julian's voice faltered as he called out, "We're about to close." The man didn't respond. Instead, he stepped forward, the clicking of his shoes against the floor echoing louder than usual. Each step seemed to suck the warmth out of the room. The man's presence felt wrong. It was as though he didn't belong. Not here, not anywhere. "I need this fixed." The man's voice was calm, but there was an undertone to it. Something unnerving. He pulled a phone from his coat pocket and placed it on the counter. It was an old, ancient flip phone. Scratches covered its surface, but the worst part was the coldness of it. The way it seemed to hum with a life of its own, as though it was something far older than it appeared. Julian forced himself to swallow, the words coming out shakier than he intended. "Sure, I can take a look." But when his fingers brushed the phone, a chill shot through his hand, like a jolt of ice running straight to his spine. He pulled his hand back instinctively, confusion and unease flooding him all at once. The man didn't flinch. His eyes remained locked on Julian, unwavering, as though there was something more than curiosity behind them. "Fix it," the man repeated, his voice low and implacable. Julian blinked, trying to shake off the creeping sense of dread tightening around his chest. I'll fix it," he murmured, but he couldn't help the tremor in his voice. He placed the phone on his workbench, fumbling with his tools, but the unease continued to build in the pit of his stomach. The man remained silent, standing in the same spot, his eyes never leaving Julian for a second. There was something hypnotic about his gaze, as though it pulled at the very air around him. Julian tried to focus on the task at hand, but the phone seemed off. He pried open the back, but what he saw made his breath catch in his throat. The internal components were twisted, warped, and coated in a black, tar-like residue that oozed as though it had been there for far too long. The wires inside didn't just look damaged, they looked wrong. Something in the pit of his stomach told him to stop, to walk away. But instead, he kept working. He replaced components and reattached wires, every movement sluggish as though the air had turned thick. And then, as if in response to his efforts, a faint hum began to emanate from the phone. At first, it was so low. Julian wondered if he was imagining it. But no, it was real, and the hum grew louder. "Did you hear that?" Julian asked, looking over his shoulder toward the man. But the man remained still, unmoving. His eyes never wavered from Julian, never blinked. He said nothing. The hum was now unmistakable, vibrating through the phone. It wasn't just a sound. It was as though the phone itself was Julian's hands shook as he continued to work, the rising panic making his movements jerky, unnatural. Then the phone turned on. The screen flickered to life, displaying an image of an ancient, fog-shrouded forest. It was the kind of image you'd expect to see in a nightmare. Too real, too vivid. It felt wrong. He looked at the man, but his face was an unreadable mask. Julian's heart thudded harder. There was a growing sense of something watching, something waiting. He slowly slid the phone back across the counter. "It's done." The man said nothing for a moment, then reached out and took the phone. His fingers brushed against Julian's hand as he did, and that same icy chill coursed through him. But then, the phone rang. The sound pierced the room. Julian froze. There was no SIM card in the phone. There was no reason for it to ring. It should have been impossible. The man didn't speak. He simply stood there, waiting for Julian to pick up the phone. A chill ran down Julian's spine, his breath coming faster now. He picked up the phone, hesitated, then held it to his ear. "Hello?" His voice was barely a whisper. At first, there was nothing but static. But then, through the crackling noise, a voice emerged, soft and distorted, but still clear enough. "Julian, you shouldn't have done this." His stomach twisted into a tight knot. "Who is this?" His voice cracked with fear. The voice didn't answer. Instead, the static grew louder, the phone's symbols glowing faintly. The lights overhead flickered, plunging the shop into a flickering strobe of shadows. Julian dropped the phone, his heart racing in panic. The man didn't move. He simply stared. He placed the phone back into his coat pocket, calm as ever. "You've done your part," he said, his voice almost too calm, too smooth. "What? What was that?" Julian choked out, the fear in his chest suffocating him. The man turned to leave, slowly, deliberately, as if time itself moved differently for him. "Wait!" Julian cried out, his voice breaking. "What just happened? Who was that?" The man paused at the door. His face still unreadable, he glanced over his shoulder. "Some things are better left unanswered." And then he was gone. The door closed with a finality that felt like the world had shifted. Julian stood frozen in the shop, his mind reeling. He had to leave. He had to get away from this place, this nightmare that had now attached itself to him. But when he got home that night, the sense of being followed didn't leave. And when he picked up his phone to call for help, he saw the message on the screen. "It's not over." His breath caught in his throat. The words, they were chilling. Julian dropped the phone in shock, and as it fell, the faint sound of whispering filled the room. The same whispers that had followed him from the shop. Fear gripped him like a vice, and Julian knew, deep in his bones, that his life was about to spiral into something far darker than he could ever imagine.